You're listening to the Millionacres Podcast. Our mission at Millionacres is to educate and empower investors to make great decisions and achieve real estate investing success. We provide regular content and perspective for everyone, from those just starting out to seasoned pros with decades of experience. At Millionacres, we work every day to help you demystify real estate investing and build real wealth.
Hello, I'm Deidre Woollard, an editor at Millionacres, and thank you so much for tuning into the Millionacres Podcast. A friend and I were talking recently about the potential available in Agtech for investors. We've discussed farmland investing on this podcast before, but I wanted to get deeper into Agtech and the potential investable ideas around both Agtech and real estate. I mean, after all, when Bill Gates is the biggest owner of farmland, that's a sign that tech and food supply are starting to merge. So to explore that topic some more today, I'm speaking with Kit Barron, who is the head of AI and automation at FarmTogether, which is one of the companies making moves in the farmland investing space. Kit's focus is on leveraging technology to shape the future of food and agriculture. He spent 6 years at the Climate Corporation, where he helped build the world's leading ag tech platform, and has also worked at the Caplog Group, Grupo Bimbo, and Harvard's Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Well, hi, Kit. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I've been a big fan of Millionacres, and I'm honored to be on the podcast today.
Excellent. So I found myself just fascinated by ag tech recently. I know that there have been some big moves on the investing side with different startups being funded. Are you seeing that interest as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I started working in the field, or at least being aware of the term ag tech about 10 years ago, most people hadn't heard of it at all. But I kind of take the long view, and if you think about it, we as a species have always invested the best of our technology in the pursuit of agriculture. And maybe apart from war, agriculture might be the oldest applications of technology that we've pursued as a species.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think some people may not know what ag tech is or what some of the possibilities are that are happening right now. What are some of the things you're excited about?
Sure. Like when I think about ag tech, it's a very, the term can be applied to a diverse array of innovation happening. So I kind of break it up into a couple of different categories. The first of them is innovation in the biology and kind of biotech space. And so you have things like advances in traditional breeding powered by data science. You have GMOs, you have gene editing with CRISPR-Cas9. There's a whole area around microbials now. We talk a lot about the gut microbiome and how bacteria are influencing human health. Well, it turns out that bacteria play a huge role in the ecosystem on the farmland, and we're just beginning to kind of scrape the surface of that. So that's kind of the category I think about for kind of biology and biotech. The next one I think about is really the hardware, and this breaks down into a couple different categories. But you have the robotics, and we can talk a little bit more later about this. But agriculture has really been on the forefront of self-driving and autonomous equipment, and we've had GPS auto-steered tractors in the field for almost 20 years now. So there's a whole fascinating group of companies that are building out the next generation of autonomous equipment in the fields. I also kind of tend to group in the hardware space some of the sensor ecosystem. So these are things that measure climatic variables and attributes of the soil. Also satellites and drones and all of these other ways to get remotely sensed data about a farm are just proliferating right now. And I think farms are really becoming, thanks to these sensors, some of the most data-rich businesses and places on Earth. And so that kind of brings me to the third category. We talked about biology, we talked about hardware. The next is data. So what do all of these sensors do? They generate data, and how can this data be applied? And so there are a number of companies that are using this data to help farmers select the right inputs, evaluate their performance, and be more efficient operators. And software really helps get those data insights to the farmer. And there's a bunch of other categories that I'm not as familiar with, things like chemistry and different kinds of practices that are evolving. But those are kind of, for me, the three big ones in ag tech are the biology, the hardware, and the data and software.
Let's start with this biome idea because I think this is really fascinating. So, how large is each individual sort of biome? Is it similar to the ways that we see different geographic regions, or is it more individual crops? How does that work out?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I learned, in my career in ag is that agriculture is not monolithic, and even when you're looking at the same crop, let's say corn, there are huge differences in terms of the way it's farmed, the types of varietals that are used, and the type of soil and weather. So we really, when I kind of think about that cross section of the crop and the geography, the biome, I think about these what we call crop geographies, and that really helps us say, all right, are there similarities between tree nuts grown in the Central Valley of California? How different is that than the way hazelnuts are grown in Oregon, for example? And so, starting to find these similarities between crop and geography regions can be helpful in understanding what's happening in those areas.
Interesting. So, as far as the hardware, is that something that you're seeing farmers be slow to adapt? I mean, obviously, farming equipment, as in a traditional sense, has looked mostly the same for a long period of time. And now it seems like it's changing really rapidly.
Yeah, I would say that in general, farmers are early adopters of technology. Now, they might not go all in with the latest thing on the shelf. They maybe try it out on a field or a test plot. But I think there's a kind of fundamental, innovators spirit that lies at the heart of most good farmers. You're constantly having to try out new things to, stay ahead of, the market and stay ahead of, things that are happening with pests and disease. I mean, when it comes to kind of hardware and equipment, one of the things that I think has changed a lot over the past 20 years is the extent to which the farm machinery has gotten larger, has gotten better connected, and has gotten smarter. And so I would actually say that, we here in San Francisco, a lot of, my friends and people in the neighborhood work on the autonomous vehicle space. And I always like to remind them that, we've had self-driving or self-steering GPS guided combines and tractors for almost 20 years on the farm. And in many ways, the farm is the perfect place to first roll out some of these technologies. You're not worried about hitting the biker or the cat running across the street. Maybe there's turkeys, a little different problem, but the broad open field is a wonderful place to pilot a lot of interesting autonomous hardware.
And does that also apply to some of the labor? I've seen some of the startups that are involved in figuring out ways to automate some of the picking and maybe change some of how things are gathered and harvested.
Yeah, when it comes to produce and tree fruits and berries, it's largely manual today. And in part of the challenge there is that, in contrast to the grains where you could have, a giant combine that has a 40-foot mouth essentially that can bring in large swaths of grain, cut it down, process it, dump it out in its bin. Each fruit and vegetable kind of requires a slightly different approach to harvesting. So there's a lot more complexity in the robotic space when it comes to harvesting fruits, vegetables, and produce. But there's a lot of interesting companies at the same time that are focused on solving those problems. Particularly when it comes to harvesting kind of more delicate things, like you could imagine a strawberry or a kiwi. One of the important parts of that technology stack is the ability for the machine to correctly identify the thing that it's picking. And imagine a ripe strawberry. You have to be really careful. Even a human hand can squish it if they're not too careful. So there's some really interesting applications of image processing and computer vision on some of the late generation harvesting equipment.
So would that be something that maybe uses machine learning because it's gradually learning what something is and whether or not it's ripe and things like that?
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to train the machine effectively to recognize the thing it's supposed to pick, be able to distinguish between the ripe tomato and the unripe tomato. There's a fascinating company in New Zealand, of course, they're focused on kiwis, somewhat stereotypically, but they've actually developed a machine learning powered pollinator for the kiwi trees. And so what they do is they've trained the machine to identify flowers that have just opened, and they take a little jet that has water with a little bit of pollen suspended in the water and spray a targeted mist or several droplets at that open flower. So you can imagine this machine going underneath these blossoming kiwi plants, spraying little droplets with suspended pollen in each ready blossom. Fascinating application of machine learning.
That is really fascinating because I know one of the things in California, for example, with the almonds, they have to bring in bees now to pollinate, and that's part of the process now. Is something like that could be adapted to maybe solve some of the problems that we have for because we don't have as many bees as we need?
Yeah, I mean, bees are absolutely an important actor. I mean, I get really optimistic about a couple of companies that are really helping make accessing bees more efficient. So there's actually, bee focused startups that I think would fall within the realm of ag tech to make it easier to get, bees as a service or bees on demand. The BAAS business is burgeoning.
I love that. Well, I think you mentioned a point about farmers and adopting technology. I think farmers are also. It seems to me have always made data based decisions, which I think businesses are sort of catching on to that more. You've sort of stood at the intersection between the two. I know you have an MBA in agribusiness from Tufts. So, what kind of drew you to that intersection of those two worlds?
There's kind of part family history and part professional history here. But my grandfather grew up on a Iowa popcorn farm, and talk about ag tech. One of the interesting innovations in corn farming back in the early 20th century was during the World War. Popcorn was the perfect packing. We talk about packing peanuts today. Popcorn was the perfect thing to like store munitions in and ship across because it was light, it was fluffy, and then the horses on the other end of the Atlantic could eat it once it arrived. So my grandfather's farm transitioned from horses to popcorn in part because of World War One. A little family anecdote about how technology and kind of innovation in ag have always been present in the industry. But he ended up leaving in the 30s and moved to the big cities in the East Coast. But he always had the best vegetable garden around and had these wonderful stories about growing up on the farm. And it was where we went for family reunions. So I think that really instilled kind of a passion and love of the land in me. And then my mom was also really influential in helping me kind of think about food systems and where our food came from. But when I, after college, really got into the international development space, focused on this idea that 25% of people across the world work in agriculture in some capacity, and that's just fascinating. But in our modern society here in the States, we in many cases it's an afterthought. And so we spend this huge part of our lives buying, transporting, preparing, eating, cleaning up after the food. Yet it's just not kind of front of mind when you think about investing in business. And so I felt like it was an overlooked and incredibly important thing for people to get into. And so for me, it was a logical kind of connection between that, that family background, some of that emotional ties to the land, and where I thought some big impact could come.
That's fascinating about the popcorn used as packing. I wish they still did that. There is that move now toward more, better materials that biodegrade because I think we're all very aware of landfills. Is that something else that you see as a potential for farming? Is some of the materials like hemp that can be used for packing?
Oh, completely. It's amazing how much genetic potential and variety is packed in a single seed. And we're seeing it, largely. I'm amazed at how many things that I used to either try to recycle or throw away are now plant-based. And here in California, you can compost them. But you can start to imagine, like with tools like CRISPR, gene and editing technology, you could start to really train a plant to produce more of the polymers that facilitate make it better equipped to be packing material. And so it's not only kind of novel processes to transform the harvest after it's grown, but also ways where you can actually work with the genetics of the plant to specifically grow for use cases like packing.
Which brings me to this idea about whether or not we need to change the way we eat. There's been a focus on plant proteins. We've seen companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Food become, billion-dollar companies. There's also this movement for, insect protein and how to make that more palatable for people. Do you think that there's going to be a sort of a fundamental shift, and are we already sort of in the midst of it?
The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN estimates that in about 10 years, we need to be growing about 40% more grains than we do today just to feed the population. And a big part of that is because we have a huge growth in the middle class. Pew did a study a couple of years ago that showed that China's middle class had grown from about 40 million people in 2000 to roughly 700 million people in 2018. From 40 million to 700 million. And like one of the first things a family does when you move into the middle class is you celebrate, you buy meat. and like personally, I love a good bone-in ribeye or a big kind of fatty Iowa raised pork chop. But I mean, the reality is we can't scale our food supply if everybody is going to be eating large amounts of animal protein all the time, or at least the way we've been raising it in the past. And so I guess the way I think about it is that there are a lot of different parts to the solution. I don't think there's any one thing. It's not like everybody going vegan. It's not everybody eating termite flour. But I think there's a whole patchwork of opportunities to find more sustainable ways to get that animal protein, from more efficient farmed fish to better genetics from the plants. And I think vertical farm and indoor farming can be part of it. Lab grown meat's fascinating. I kind of joked about insect flour, but the potential of a termite mound to produce massive amounts of healthy protein is also pretty fascinating. So I kind of see them all as part of the solution. And I think there's this golden age of food science and data science and bioscience coming together to solve that problem. So it's just a fascinating time for people that are investing in the space and for younger people looking for career directions.
I think the other thing I'm worried about too is water. I lived in Southern California for a while, and I became very, very aware of the issues of drought. Certainly, we're seeing it all across the country, and so is that also part? Do you think that's part of ag tech as well? Maybe it's engineering seeds that need less water or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of parts to that. One is the genetics, as you mentioned, and there, in the 90s and 2000s, there was a big effort to develop more drought tolerant and drought resistant hybrids for things like corn. And I think those types of projects are incredibly important, and hope that the big breeding companies can continue to invest in that type of innovation. But we're also seeing that out here at UC Davis in California is hard at work on new varieties of tree nuts and other crops that can get by with less water. But another part of that is just the irrigation infrastructure. And you think about flood irrigation as a very inefficient way to use water when so much of that is subject to evaporation. So now you start to see these micro irrigation drip systems that are providing very small precise amounts of water at precise times. And that's all enabled by data and sensor network to help you identify when a particular plant is stressed, when it needs the water. And so I think we can this convergence between the software, the data science, and the hardware and biology is a fascinating part of kind of solving that water problem that you mentioned.
Well, and the University of California, Davis has just been one of the leaders that I've seen in, whether it's, vineyards or things like that. They've got a great program there. Are there other universities or programs that you know of that are doing really interesting things?
It's pretty amazing in this country, the land grant network of universities that was set up federally. Just a fascinating network of universities that have at their core a mission to advance agriculture. And I'm not, necessarily familiar with all of the different breeding programs out there, but it's pretty cool to see how much innovation is coming out of just kind of broader agricultural innovation and innovators coming out of the land grant universities.
All right, this is a great place to take a short break.
Like what you're hearing? Get more real estate investing news and advice from Millionacres on Instagram at Millionacres and on Twitter at Millionacres_co.
During our break today, we are excited to have Millionacres lead investment analyst Matt Argersinger here to speak briefly about one of our newest services, Real Estate Winners. Thank you for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
So what is Real Estate Winners and who is it for?
Well, I like to think of Real Estate Winners as our answer to Stock Advisor in the real estate market. It is a service that provides recommendations on publicly traded real estate investment trusts and real estate companies. So it's a pretty big universe out there. There's over 200 REITs to choose from, and probably dozens, if not hundreds, of real estate companies are in our universe. And we provide regular investment recommendations as well as commentary on the market, educational material. And it's really designed to get anyone who's interested in investing and learning about real estate started.
So is it geared toward new investors or is it more for seasoned pros?
I think Real Estate Winners can serve both. I think if you're a new investor, maybe you're just getting started with stocks and you want to learn more about how to add real estate to your portfolio, great place to start. If you're a seasoned investor and just thinking, okay, how can I diversify my portfolio, maybe reduce the volatility in my portfolio, maybe add some income to my portfolio, then I think Real Estate Winners is a great solution for that cohort as well.
Fantastic. What are the benefits of being a member of Real Estate Winners?
Number one benefit is day one when you join, you get our top 10 investment ideas at the moment. So really right from the beginning, you know what our 10 best ideas in the publicly traded real estate market are. And then going forward on a monthly basis, you'll get a new recommendation, sometimes more than one new recommendation, as well as regular content that we're coming out. We're covering our past recommendations, providing updates, and talking about the real estate market. So it's really the full package.
Perfect. So what do you need to get started?
Really all you need is a discount brokerage account. So if you're used to buying stocks, and you probably already have that. If you haven't bought stocks in the past, of course, just open a discount brokerage account. These days, you don't even have to pay commissions. It's fantastic. So it really couldn't be easier to get started investing with Real Estate Winners.
Sounds fantastic. So how can people sign up?
Sure. They can head over to real.fool.com. That's real.fool.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. I'm back with Kit Barron of FarmTogether, and we're talking about Agtech. So in this segment, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what FarmTogether does and what you're specifically doing with FarmTogether.
Sure. Well, at FarmTogether, I've been in the first part of this podcast talking a lot about all of the innovation applied to agriculture over the centuries, and particularly the last couple of decades. And all of that has generated a asset class that has historically appreciated significantly in value. And we believe that everybody should have farmland in their investment portfolio. We believe that because the long-term appreciation stats that I mentioned, it's also a real asset hedge against inflation. It pays a dividend every year in terms of the harvest. And it's amazing. It's very uncorrelated to stocks and bonds, and even very low correlation to commercial and residential real estate. So we believe that farmland should be a core part of everybody's investing portfolio, but it's really hard to invest in a farm, unless you're like big Bill Gates and you have millions of dollars to throw around, or you want to get into farming yourself. You can't go and buy 2 acres somewhere and expect it to be a productive asset. So what we're really trying to do is democratize investing in farmland, make it easy for anybody to own a share in a farm and share in the harvest and share in that appreciation over time.
Well, I know there's multiple kinds of crops. There's, the row crops. There's grains. There's tree crops. Is FarmTogether looking at different varieties, and what locations are you looking at?
Yeah, we're growing quite quickly right now. So we have a fairly wide lens where a lot of the team's background comes from, and where about 80% of our investments so far have been focused is in the permanent crop space. And so that's the tree nuts, apples and citrus. We're also actively expanding into row crops, so your corn and your soy, which tend to have slightly lower return, but a more regular cash flow, less development costs. And so our permanent crop portfolio tends to be more focused in the West Coast, and a row crop more in the Midwest. But we're certainly constantly looking for new opportunities and new geographies, and building out our team and network on the ground.
So is part of what you do figuring out which technology should be used on which farms, or identifying new companies that are doing interesting things? What specifically is your role?
There's kind of three problems that I'm bringing technology to bear on in my role. The first is finding farms that are a great fit for our investors and our investment strategy. And the second is underwriting those farms efficiently. So how do we use data to help us understand risk and evaluate upside? And then the third is, once those farms are in our management portfolio, how do we roll out the right tech stack on the farm to help us remotely monitor and ensure that everything is going well for these investments that our investors own.
I love that idea of the tech stack for farming. So what kind of things would go into that tech stack?
Sure. Well, first thing you need is what we call an FMIS, or a farm management information system. And so this is basically the core software platform around which you store data, develop plans, evaluate performance, and kind of generate reports. In addition to that, we have other sensor integrations that we're exploring. So how do we have individual weather sensors or soil sensors on the property to help us kind of remotely monitor? We could also subscribe to satellite feeds, and so we could get a regular supply of interesting images and insights from space on what's happening on the farm. And all of these things together both help us identify ways to increase efficiency on the farms that we manage, but it also generates great investor collateral. So, Deidre, if you end up investing in our next organic pistachio deal, I would love for you to be able to log in and see a pole-mounted camera of the pistachios when they're in bloom, so you could do literally watch the grass grow on the farm that you're a co-owner of. So we really want to increase investor transparency with the assets that they hold.
Interesting. So as you acquire new farms, are there farmers in place on there, or are you bringing in the management team and the tech stack as part of the acquisition process?
Yeah, we have a big part of our strategy, and this is really fundamental to agriculture, is having good partners you work with on the ground. And so we tend to build portfolios around best-in-class operators in different parts of the country. They often specialize in a particular crop type. And so we leverage our relationships with those partners both to find land, to come up with the agronomic plan, the redevelopment plan in some cases, and then they ultimately farm and manage the property on our behalf. And so we work with them to figure out what's the right set of technological solutions for a given farm without overly disrupting operations, of course.
So we're having a kind of a weird winter, a lot of ice storms. We've seen different things happening. How does FarmTogether kind of plan for that, and how are you building the future of climate change into your portfolio as you go forward?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say is, we tend to think farmland's a great, long-term investment. And so a lot of our deal time horizons end up being, 8, 10, 12 years. And so that really allows us and our investors to overcome any, seasonal variation or, extreme weather event. Now, that said, I should also mention we've been piloting secondary markets to allow investors to get some liquidity, in case there's an interest in that. And that's something we're going to be continuing to pursue on upcoming farm deals. So that's kind of how we think about the short-term weather events. We also get crop insurance to help protect against the unforeseen extreme events. And that's a great financial product subsidized by the federal government through the Farm Bill. So a really wonderful way to protect an investment on the short term. Now, longer term, you mentioned not just the extreme weather event, but we also are contending with climate change. And so we have a very, it's one of the things we think the most about when it comes to evaluating investment properties, particularly on the West Coast. And so we look at a couple of different things. We look at both potential downside associated with climate change. Are there regions that will become less productive over time because of drought and or temperature? But we also look at potential upside. Are there has the frost-free date moved forward in the spring by a couple of weeks? Does that change the viable geography for a particular crop we're interested in? So I think there's both kind of downside and upside. One very kind of practical reality, particularly in California, is water supply risk, and so we're building out our data science model to help us really understand a field level water supply risk that looks into environmental, biological, and some of the political, like water management practices, and helps us develop an index that says, hey, what's the water supply risk of a particular property? And we really are very conservative when it comes to water, and try not to, typically don't move on a farm unless we're very confident that it has a reliable, sustainably managed water source for the foreseeable future.
That makes sense. I know a lot of investors are concerned about ESG investing, wanting to make sure that environmental, social, and governance factors are considered. Obviously, farming has a lot of attention in that area, and people want to be part of things. Are you seeing more interest in organic? Are there concerns also about labor and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've recently signed on with a sustainable farming standard called Leading Harvest. And so we've committed to enrolling 100% of our acres in the Leading Harvest program, which lays out a number of practices to help promote regenerative and sustainable farming. We also, one of our biggest and kind of most successful deals was a transition from a conventional Red Delicious orchard to organic Cosmic Crisp and Sweet Tango orchard up in Washington. And the family farm that we partnered with is one of the largest organic apple producers, stem-milk growers in the region. And they're and beyond just the benefits of the transitioning to organic, that family operation has just phenomenal reputation when it comes to the way they treat their workers and laborers. We were on a webinar with our farming partner there, and he was talking about how the company makes available full-time staff doctors for all the farm laborers. And so it's just this very novel way to take care of their valued labor supply, particularly during a time like 2020 during the pandemic. So, it's things like that, and really finding these best-in-class operators that know how to treat their people, know how to treat the land, that give us confidence that the investments our investors are making are going to continue to appreciate in the long term.
I love that. And I think you said something really interesting there that I kind of wanted to dive into. The transition from Red Delicious to Cosmic Crisp, I think, is kind of interesting because Red Delicious, traditional apple, nobody's really a fan of that apple anymore. Whereas you have the Cosmic Crisp, which is kind of one of those trendy apples. A lot of people have talked about it. Does that kind of play a role in some of the farming? Is that there are these different varietals or different foods that become trendy?
Oh, totally. And they're designed to be trendy. Red Delicious was trendy, but it was designed for a separate set of attributes. It was designed for long shelf life and great shelf appeal. That bright red, classic Red Delicious color was really novel in the supermarkets when it hit 25, 30 years ago, or longer, I guess. And so we're always on the lookout for interesting new hybrids. The Cosmic Crisp it's a Honey Crisp crossed with another variety. So it has this wonderful flavor profile, but it also has these great agronomic these traits that make it easier to farm and easier to farm organically. And so it's kind of the breeders are constantly looking at how do you make the flavor profile, the shelf life, the shelf appeal, the agronomics attractive, and occasionally they come up with these rock stars like Cosmic Crisp, and we were lucky enough to partner with a grower who had access to licenses of that variety, so we were able to pass that along to our investors.
There's sort of a concern about GMOs at the same time that there's an interest in GMOs and the idea that they can help grow more food in a certain area. How do you kind of balance those two factors?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of confusion around the distinction between, breeding and GMO and now CRISPR-Cas9. And just to kind of, one thing to note is the cosmic crisp, for example, was not a GMO. This was bred the traditional way that humans have been breeding plants, since time immemorial. And one example that I love talking about is Brassica oleracea, Latin name for broccoli. Also the Latin name for kale, rutabaga, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage. So all of these plants descended from the same wild ancestor, and it was through cultivation, traditional breeding methods over the past several thousand years that have got us this rich array of brassicas, from Brussels sprouts to cauliflower to broccoli and kale. And so that just kind of shows you the amazing amount of genetic potential that exists in one humble cabbage species. And so that's kind of all in the realm of traditional breeding. There's also, and then the GMOs, where you're actively going in and modifying the genetic material with genetic information from another species. And then you have, and this is really interesting, very relevant right now, the CRISPR revolution and the new gene editing technologies. And a court in France, which has historically been one of the kind of biggest opponents of GMO, has recently ruled that CRISPR technology would not be considered GMO under the kind of French, agricultural standards. But that being said, GMOs have been around for several decades now, and they're a huge part of the American food supply. And I think there's a lot of kind of misinformation about the impacts. And of course, it's important to understand new technologies, particularly when you're having your kids eat them. But GMO has been around the block, and there's a couple of we talked about the drought-resistant corn project focused on developing genetic corn that's corn genetics that are more drought tolerant. That's a great example of the kind of things that can come out of GMO technology. Another one I'd mention, I used to do some work down in South Africa when we were moving FieldView, the Climate Corporation's software product, to South Africa, and I remember being in a cornfield that was full of birds, and I was kind of talking to the farmer there, and he said, Kit, this is so wonderful. This is thanks to GMO. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, these plants now have the ability to create a protein that kills certain kind of pest insects, but it doesn't target the rest of the insects. It used to be we'd blanket spray pesticides over every acre in this field, and it would kill everything, beneficial and non-beneficial insects, and it would kill the birds. And he said, now today, because of this very targeted GMO technology, we have birds again in my field, and I love it. And it was just a kind of this, the other side of the coin is the story that you don't always hear.
Excellent. You mentioned earlier that 25% of the world is involved in some form of agriculture. How much are you keeping track of what other countries are doing in terms of food supply? And is that impacting the way that FarmTogether looks at things?
So, to date, at least, from FarmTogether's perspective, we're very much focused on the U.S. market, but we're a very young company. We've only been doing farmland deals for a little under 2 years now. So we certainly have ambitions to take the model that we've been building out here in the States abroad. But I think there's a lot of interesting innovation happening everywhere. I mean, but I think in many ways the United States is leading the charge. One stat that I love to reference is, the average global corn production is about 120 bushels an acre, somewhere between 100 and 120 bushels an acre. In the United States, the average is around 180 last year. And last year, the National Corn Growers Association, they hold a contest every year to see who can grow the most corn on an acre of farmland. The winner of it raised over 400 bushels an acre. So it's like 3x what we produce and 4x what the global average is. So it's just a demonstration of how much opportunity there still is to increase yields. using the latest technologies.
Is there any concern about surpluses? I know in the past there used to be surpluses that then would be because farmers would be concerned about prices. Is that something that factors into that as well?
At the end of the day, it's a good problem to have as a global economy, and we'd much rather have surplus food than not enough. Um, but I still think there's something like 30% of all food produced goes to waste in some part of the value chain. So yeah, it's certainly something I worry about, and I think there's a lot of smart people, focusing on it. Certainly, I think at the beginning of the COVID outbreak in the United States, it kind of came as a shock for me to see, just huge mountains of onions and potatoes going to spoil because restaurants were closed, and they're such a big consumer of some of those crops. So it just kind of gave me a window into how a reminder of how interconnected farmland is with the broader economy.
Does FarmTogether think about government subsidies at all? Is there a relationship between FarmTogether and the farms and the government at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying. The United States has some of the most generous farm benefit programs anywhere in the world, and maybe with the exception of the EU. And so things like double depreciation and kind of super accelerated depreciation, which provides some great tax write-offs to both investors and farmers themselves. We benefit from a crop insurance program that is federally regulated, and we benefit from things like there's a whole suite of programs to incentivize more sustainable farming practices. And so, for example, you could enroll in a strip till program, which is less disruptive to the soil and allows the microbes to regenerate. And there's a federal program that compensates you on a per acre basis for adopting that practice. And so there are all sorts of programs out there that we can kind of tap into to encourage kind of better farming practices and also generate some additional returns for our investors.
It's accredited investors only right now?
Yes, today it's accredited investors only, and we're working on finding ways to bring farmland investment opportunities to more retail investors as well. But right now it's accredited only.
Excellent. And around how many deals are you doing on an average basis? Are you bringing on new farms every month or every couple of months?
Yeah, we're bringing on a new farm every other week or so.
Oh, wow.
And we're going to try to significantly scale that up so we have a very regular cadence of farms on the platform, particularly given the last couple have sold out within hours. We've been so much demand for it. We created a program for first-time investors to get, we only sold shares to first-time investors for the first 3 hours of the offering. And I think the deal sold out in like 3 hours and 30 minutes. So we're constantly looking for great farms, and we're going to be accelerating the pace of launching farms on the platform over 2021.
Interesting. And do you find that your investors are diversifying within farmland? Like, are they getting some row crops and also getting some tree nut farms? Is that a consideration? Is location part of that?
Absolutely. We're seeing that farmers or our investors are. We're seeing a lot of repeat investors, which is great. But we also see that there's a tendency to, hey, if they've just invested in a pistachio orchard, they might go for an almond or an apple next time around. So certainly, it seems like there's some, not quite enough data to say that for sure, but definitely seems to be an interest in diversifying across different crops and geographies. And we want to play into that. I think eventually we want to be able to offer, baskets of farmland exposure. So that individuals don't necessarily have to pick farm by farm. But we're a startup and constantly innovating, so we love hearing ideas from investors about what they want, what's motivating them to invest in farmland. And so we're very still quite agile company and able to move quickly to pursue good new ideas. So keep them coming.
So what's the exit strategy like because you mentioned that they're long-term holds, you're holding things for 8 to 10 years. Are the investors in for that period of time, or is there the ability to cash in their shares or give those shares to other people? How does that work?
Yeah, originally the way a lot of the investment offerings were written, it was that kind of longer term hold period. And we felt that was really important to get the returns that, we think are possible and history has shown us are possible in farmland. But long-term hold periods aren't for everybody. And so we realized that was going to become a barrier to investing in farmland. So we've begun to pilot secondary offerings where there'll be regular liquidity events. I don't know if it's going to be biannual or annual, but that allow investors to sell their shares or buy into a farm deal that they may have missed in the past. And so we ran a successful pilot of this, I guess last month, and it was worked really well. So we're kind of building out that as part of our product roadmap.
That's excellent. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to ask your opinion about some of the farming innovations we've seen lately in terms of both vertical farming and warehouse farming. App Harvest recently went public. I know there's a lot of buzz about that one, even though it's relatively small. What are you thinking about some of these innovations?
We're going to need a patchwork of solutions to help feed the globe. I think some of the indoor farming operations that I've seen, and I've visited a couple, they're relatively niche, like focused on culinary herbs for high value urban supermarkets. And so, that's not necessarily going to feed the planet, but it's the innovation that they're developing is going to, I believe, get better and better. Right now, it's really hard to compete with the sun and soil. When it comes to free energy supply, but innovations in LEDs and solar technology, I think are going to continue to show that these indoor farming companies are on the right track, and eventually the unit economics will come around. It's just a matter of time. And we may never feed the planet with rolling wheat inside a 200-story building in downtown Detroit, but I think they're certainly going to play a role in the longer term food system. I'm actually really bullish on, and I did some work in the fisheries in the past, but I think there's a tremendous amount of potential for indoor fish farming, just a really dense way to grow high quality, healthy animal protein, and particularly if we can build breeding programs to design feeding stock for those fish and shrimp that are sustainably grown. I think it can really be a great part of the solution as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was a fascinating conversation. And just a reminder for listeners, you can find out more at FarmTogether.com. So stay well and stay invested.
Thank you for tuning in to the Millionacres Podcast. I hope you liked today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing through your favorite podcast provider. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a line at help@millionacres.com. Stay well and stay invested. People on this program may have an interest in the deals, offerings, or services they discuss that Millionacres or the Motley Fool may have a formal recommendation for or against. Always consult a certified tax professional before acting on tax advice, and do not buy or sell assets based solely on what you hear.